All right, well, good evening, everyone. I'd like to go ahead and get started with our normal greetings and telling you what's going to be coming up. Tonight's program is the first of our Historic Red Hook 2022 series. And I, of course, am your Dutchess County historian, Will Tatum, subbing tonight for Executive Director Elizabeth Tatum, who is up in Albany attending her PhD coursework. So she's out there learning how to do even more for Historic Red Hook. We have several programs coming up after this one to keep us going through this spring. Our next program is going to feature our local historian, Sarah Hermans, author of the 1903 Jackson Corners Signature Quilt book. So this is not only a look at the greater Red Hook area about 100 years ago, it's also delving into the field of material culture analysis. So how all of that old stuff tells a story, as well as looking good in museum collections and as interior decoration. That's going to be on Wednesday, March 16th at 7 p.m. via Zoom. So you will be able to join us regardless of the weather and your location. In April, we will begin to introduce our in-person programming for 2022. In early April, we will have our Member Appreciation Day. And then later in the month, we will be introducing a new Tavern Night fundraiser. So that's going to be a lot of excitement in the Elmendorf Inn. It'll be wonderful to invite folks back in again. And you should look forward to receiving more details on that, both in future newsletters and on the Society webpage. We'll go ahead and get that information flowing once we have it in hand. So without further ado, since I think we're all here, it is my signal pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. So Andrea Mosterman is Associate Professor in Atlantic History and the Joseph Tregle Professor in Early American History at the University of New Orleans. In her work, she explores the multifaceted dimensions of slavery, slave trade, and cross-cultural contact in the Dutch Atlantic and early America, with special emphasis on early New York. She has published her work in the Journal of African History and Early American Studies, and she curated the digital exhibit Slavery in New Netherland for the New Netherland Institute. Her book, Spaces of Enslavement, and you can get that for 40% off at Cornell Press using the code that came with your registration email, won the 2020 Hendricks Award for Best Book-Length Manuscript relating to New Netherland and the Dutch colonial experience. And I would personally like to point out that one of the most powerful elements of this book is its exploration of space. It's spatial analysis, which is still something of a new approach in history circles, but it's important to remember that history is not just an abstract that happened. It's not just about the material left behind. It's also about the place where it happened, which is why, especially here in local history, we say there's no substitute for being on the scene. So if you have questions during Professor Mustaman's presentation, please feel free to pop those into the chat box. I'll be monitoring it, and I will unmute everyone once we reach the Q&A session. So without further ado, Professor Mosterman, please take us away.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for that introduction. And thank you all for joining on Zoom. It's really wonderful to be able to do this from afar. I am in New Orleans right now, where it is in the 70s, very different from New York right now. And you know, I'm very grateful to be able to join you via Zoom, even while being far away. So my book, Spaces of Enslavement, The History of Slavery and Resistance in Dutch New York, looks at slavery in predominantly Dutch communities in early New York. And I look at slavery and the lives of enslaved people in these areas from really the entire period of enslavement by Europeans in this region, from about 1626, when the first Africans were brought into the colony of New Netherland, until 1827 with the abolition of slavery in New York. For the colonial period, I focused on particularly New Amsterdam and to some extent the colony more broadly. And then for the 18th century, really to try to limit my research, because it's quite extensive already to look at 200 years of enslavement in this region, I focused on a few counties in particular, although I included research from other areas. The counties that I focused on were Kings County, so roughly what today is Brooklyn, New York, Ulster County, and Albany County, what Albany County looked like in 1790, so significantly larger as it would be now, as it is now. I looked at the ways in which these Dutch Americans in those communities use their dominance over various spaces to be able to control and monitor enslaved people in these areas. And as a part of that, I examine how this develops over time. Whereas in the 17th century, we see this much less so. Over the course of the 18th century, we see that there's various systems that are being developed in these communities that that allow for this more closely monitoring. We see more systems of segregation, surveillance, and so forth. So what I'll do today is that I'll talk a little bit about how I came to this topic, in particular, how I came to think about these spaces and focus my research on that. And I'll give you a little bit examples of some of the spaces that I looked at and the things that I discovered through that focus. And I will say that the particular spaces that I looked at for the 18th and early 19th century were the public space, the home, and the Dutch Reformed Church. So I'll focus on those in my talk as well. Hold on, I'm trying to, there it is. So I want to start though with my visit to the Maison des Esclaves in Senegal, so very far from New York. I visited there in July of 2010. And at the time I was writing my dissertation, I was actually finishing up my dissertation on slavery in New York. And I was looking in particular at Dutch and African exchanges and kind of cultural exchanges in early New York. And I had read, so I had read at this point a lot of sources already on slavery in New York and more broadly in the Atlantic world. But this particular visit really made me rethink how to approach this study. And that was because as I was in Senegal, we visited the House of Slaves, Maison des Esclaves, on Gorée Island, which is actually named after a Dutch island. So the Dutch have a history here, well, a history of slavery and colonization. This House of Slaves was used on Gorée Island as part of the Senegambian trade, the Atlantic trade of people. And so this was one of the places where enslaved men, women, children were held before they were transported to other parts of the Atlantic. And when I visited here, I had a very physical response to these spaces, especially when I was entering the space where the enslaved men and women were really held. And you know, you have to imagine that people were in these spaces, oftentimes in very cramped, unsanitary conditions. Sometimes they were held in these spaces for a day, sometimes for days, weeks, and it could, in some cases, even be as much as months. It really depended on the trade and ships that were available and so forth, and how many people there were. And so these are really, you know, in many ways, horrific spaces that are really a very physical reminder of the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade and the Atlantic trade. And when I entered that particular space where these the men were held, I instantly felt physically ill in a way that had never happened when reading about the history of slavery. And this really triggered something. It made me think more carefully about the spaces. So I had read a lot about slavery in New York. I'd read documents about this, but I hadn't really visited a lot of these spaces and really thinking about where would enslaved people have lived in these New York homes? Where would they have been in the churches? How would they have navigated the streets of these various New York towns and cities and such? And so when I returned to the United States and was working on the revisions of my dissertation and turning it into a book, I really started to think more carefully about space, and I made it a point to visit those spaces. And one of those spaces was the Garrett Spaces at the Lott House. So the Lott House is located in Brooklyn, New York, built by the Lott family, a family of Dutch origin, in the 1730s. And the initial house they built is this structure. The building, the addition that you see here was built in the early 19th century. But the initial structure was this home. And this was like an all-purpose living space, a one house, one room home, which was very common in colonial America. And then this was the sleeping area, kind of like an attic area where the Lott family would have slept. Not long after they built this space, they added this lean-to kitchen that you see here. And what researchers discovered just a couple of decades ago was it was, from what I understand, quite incidental, that a groundskeeper in a closet in that kitchen found that the ceiling that it was actually moving, and that you could open it and pull out a ladder, and that ladder led to this little stairwell. This door was a door to this sleeping area of the Lott family. And on the sides, there were these Garrett spaces, and you see one of them depicted here in this photograph. And archaeologists found that people actually lived in these spaces. They were able to find this from various pieces of evidence. Candle wax is one of them, a beehive-styled oven that was created in the chimney that you can see running through this space right here. And so they were able to establish that enslaved people enslaved by the Lott family, very likely lived in this space. And I've put some of their names, the ones that we know were enslaved by the Lott family in the latter part of the 18th century, which were Mary, Hannah, Mel, Kate, Harry, Hector, Powell, and the children, Cyrus, Jan, Jacob, Hannah, and Paul. And when visiting this place, I mean, the images you see here were taken by an professional photographer. I went up that little stairwell and used my phone, the light of my phone, to kind of see. There's no natural light coming in, no windows whatsoever. You can't stand up in those spaces. It would have been incredibly hot in the summers, drafty, and very small, especially if we consider that a significant number of people likely shared those spaces. So it gave me a perspective of thinking about the spaces that these enslaved people were inhabiting. And it helped me then think about how they would have experienced those spaces. I also participated in the Slave Dwelling Project when I had an opportunity to do so. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with this or have taken part in this. It's really a great project where you have the opportunity to actually stay in these spaces of enslavement. And this was not in New York. I was not able to do this in New York, but I was able to do it at Stenton Hall in Pennsylvania, just outside of Philadelphia. And this is a Georgian style home, very similar to Schuyler Mansion or the Tim Brooke Mansion in Albany. And really, you know, we see a lot of those types of buildings, the same architectural style across New York, especially for the 18th century elite. And so part of what you do when you take part in the Slave Dwelling Project is that you stay in these spaces. And we did so in the Garrett space, where here we had first a meeting, and then eventually we stayed there overnight. Some people stayed on a different floor. I stayed in this particular Garrett space where they believed that enslaved people had lived. And one of the things that stood out when staying in that space was actually the noises of the home. The fact that the people who were on the lower level, if they were moving, we could hear that so vividly. that it made me really think about the ways in which people would have been able to move through these homes, especially if we think about enslaved people who might, try to navigate these homes without being noticed. That would likely have been very difficult to do so. And just spending time in that space really kind of, helped think through what it really meant to live and work in those spaces. Now, I also made a point of going to the various churches that I wrote about and really studying the architecture and thinking through where enslaved people would have been located in those churches, if they were allowed in the churches, when they were allowed in the churches. So in many cases, we see that for much of the 18th century, enslaved people were really kept out of a lot of these churches. When they were allowed to participate, they oftentimes were restricted to seating in the back of the church, either on the first floor or the gallery, or sometimes both. In the case of the First Church of Albany, which you see depicted here, and this is a photograph taken from those back seats of the gallery, the enslaved people and free Black congregants were restricted to back areas of both the first floor and the gallery. And in fact, as you can see here, even that was controversial at times. Daniel Winner here in 1815 actually wanted the Black people close to his pew removed. And there's several documents like that where people are really objecting to the close proximity of Black members of the church or Black congregants. But thinking about, going to those spaces and sitting on those benches, it also helped me think through, what would people have been able to see? How well would I have been able to hear this sermon? And how was this organized in such a way that they perhaps could have taken advantage sometimes of that as well, with them being somewhat separated in these churches? Perhaps they were able to also use that to communicate with people, loved ones who were living in different areas and were attending church at the same time. Now, when we look at the 17th century, we don't have any structures that are left that I could visit, but I did walk the streets of Lower Manhattan, amongst others, and really trying to think about the ways in which enslaved Africans in New Amsterdam would have navigated the streets. One of those streets being South Williams, which at the time was the Slijksteeg, where in fact a lot of the people enslaved by the Dutch West India Company resided. And you can see that depicted here by number 1. One of the things I did when thinking about these spaces was trying to kind of map out in New Amsterdam in my very kind of, basic way, my basic capabilities of being able to do such a thing. Try to map what were some of the locations, what were some of the important spaces that they would have frequented. And so if we see right here by number 1, that's the house for the people enslaved by the company in much of the 1640s and 1650s. There were taverns. One is right on the corner here. Another one is around the corner. There were lots of taverns in New Amsterdam. So those certainly were not the only ones. But this one, as you can see, this one is Madeleine Vincent's Tavern, was right down the street of where these people lived. And then Rutgerson's Tavern, which apparently was more popular amongst these enslaved men, was just around the corner. Now, one of the interesting things we see in New Amsterdam is that enslaved people were able to actually participate in the Dutch Reformed Church. We see them use the courts to fight for property, or in some cases wages. And we see them in the taverns. And one of the interesting thing is that when you map this and when you think about those spaces, what really stood out to me is that one of the things that allowed them to be able to do so, first of all, is that there was no legislation that kept them out of those spaces. There was nothing that said you cannot attend the Dutch Reformed Church, or if you are an enslaved person, you cannot use the courts. And so they were able to take advantage of that lack of restrictions. But we also see that the close proximity of where they lived and where they labored to many of those places also made it possible for them to actually attend the Dutch Reformed Church, use the courts. So when we look at the courts, initially the council was in charge of all legal cases until the city established its own courthouse right here, number 4, the council being located in the fort right there. This is where one of the initial churches was located at Pedelstraat. Later on, at number 6, the Dutch Reformed Church was located in the fort. All of those are in walking distance, as you can see, from where they actually would have lived, or many of them would have lived. And that allowed them to use those spaces and to navigate that town in a way that would become impossible later on. And this is where I want to talk a little bit about then how these spaces increasingly were being used to control enslaved people and to really, as a way to sustain this system of human bondage in New York. As by the latter part of the 17th century and into the 18th century, we see that the number of individuals who are enslaving people is growing. The population in general is growing. And with that, the enslaved population is also increasing significantly. And what we see happening then is that as early as the late 17th century, 1682, you see here mentioned the ordinance that prohibited enslaved New Yorkers from leaving their enslaver's property without his or her consent. And subsequent laws really increasingly limited the activities and the movement of enslaved people in New York. And I mentioned a few here, but there's many more. So for example, enslaved New Yorkers were no longer allowed to sell goods. They were no longer allowed to purchase alcohol. They were no longer allowed to move through the streets without a pass, some sort of a permission from their enslavers to actually do so. We also see that in places like New York City, enslaved people are no longer allowed to gather in groups more than 4 or 3 in some cases. They're no longer allowed to walk the streets at night unless they have a lantern. And so there's increasing legislation that limits the movement of really free and enslaved Black New Yorkers. But it is free and enslaved Black New Yorkers because there's a presumption that if somebody has a dark skin color, that they would be enslaved unless they can prove otherwise. So there's actually a law at some point that does not allow Black people to rake for oysters off of Long Island unless they are accompanied by a white person. So their activities in these public spaces are oftentimes considered illegitimate unless they can prove that they have the somehow the permission to be there or to do the things that they're doing. And with that, we see that there's pass systems, patrols, and so forth to really enforce that. What I'm sharing with you here is the Society of Apprehending Slaves, which was founded in Shanghai in 1796. And this is just one example of enslavers coming together and organizing to be able to recapture any person who tries to flee the person that is holding them in bondage. They had a whole system, and writers, enslavers had to submit the names of the people that potentially, you know, that they claimed to own, that they could be asked to search for. And so there were also writers, but as you will see here, it actually says here, resolved that every writer or any other person who shall detect and bring back to his master any runaway slave or slaves shall be entitled to receive from the society the sum of $15 for every such runaway slave, and also all reasonable expenses. And this, we see this across the region, is that it's not just particular people who are assigned these writer positions. And in the cities, actually, it's oftentimes watchmen or bellmen who are hired to control the streets and to monitor any activities in the streets of anybody, but that also includes enslaved people. It also allows for any white person basically to stop a Black person and demand that they provide some sort of evidence that they're in that space legitimately. And if they cannot do that, they could get an award if this turns out to be actually somebody who's trying to flee their enslaver. So these are some of the ways that within the public space, we see that there's an increasing limitation of the movements of enslaved people through legislation and past systems and such. Now, we also see that within the church, enslaved people are increasingly kept out of these spaces, these spaces of worship. One document that talks about this that really stood out to me, it's a document that I discovered at the Brooklyn Historical Society, and it was written by Reverend Peter Lowe, who was one of the 2 reverends of the 6 congregations of Kings County. And in this letter, he talks about a group of Black men who had asked to become full members in the church. And he is willing to accept them. He was ready to accept them. He actually, in fact, called it, he literally says, I thought they were worthy. But his congregants object to doing so. And in his letter, he lists 10 of their objections. And I've added a few here on these slides. So I'll quote them. The first one being that they would have no souls. Another one, the 4th objection, they are a species very different from us. Witness their nauseous sweat, complexion, and manners, etc. I cannot endure them near me and would be ashamed to commune with them. And then objection 8, if many Negroes be admitted, I tremble for the ark, adieu, order, and harmony in the Dutch church. See the absurd consequences. Negroes will at length summon their masters before the consistory, nay, will constitute a consistory themselves. What an awful sight. Negro elders, deacons, church masters, etc. And, some of the other objections actually were, we would be too much like the Methodists if we would admit Black people in our congregation. Another objection was that they are the descendants of Ham. They are supposed to be servants. And what is very clear from their objections, and I should note that Reverend Peter Lowe did not agree with any of their objections. He wanted to admit them, but he couldn't do so without the support from his congregation. One of the things that really stands out here is that, the physical proximity also was part of this, and as well as the challenge to the social hierarchy. The church really being not just a religious institution, but also a very important social space and social institution. And clearly these enslavers were worried that if they'd accept Black members, enslaved people in their church, and I should note that at this particular point in time in Kings County, in Flatbush, there was about 50% close to 50% of the population was enslaved, and about 75% of the households held people in bondage. So it really was, a significant part of the population, and many of these congregants would have enslaved people themselves. And so it's very clear that they objected to including Black people in their church because they did not want to share that space with them, but also because they felt like that might challenge the social hierarchies of their society. How can you justify accepting someone as an equal before God, but then, when you go home, you enslave them, or, you treat them like property? And I have no doubt that this is why, and I should note before I talk about James Murphy, so we see this across New York, that in many of the 18th century churches, enslaved people are not accepted, are not very present. There are exceptions. And so this is not across the board. It really depended on the congregation. And so there are some churches that had Black members, but many of them did not. Most of them did not. And when they did, by the latter part of the 18th century and the early 19th century, when we do see more Black members being accepted in these churches, and this is largely part of the Second Great Awakening and other factors that caused, one of them being the American independence and these ideas of freedom and equality for all. All of this kind of influenced an increasing acceptance of enslaved people and Black members into these churches. Still, these Black members then were oftentimes restricted to backbenches in the church. So they still were very much separated and oftentimes had to wait to get communion until white congregants had done so. They were still not treated as equals. And so going to James Murphy then, whom you've seen portrayed here, he was the child of an enslaved woman, a woman enslaved in Dutchess County. And he was enslaved upon birth. But his enslaver, whom they believe may have been his father, in fact, had him freed upon his death. And James Murphy, after gaining his freedom, went to the seminary in New Brunswick, for the Dutch Reformed Church, and became a minister in the church. He became an ordained minister at the Clove Warsing and Rochester churches in 1814. And became part of a controversy about a decade later when several members discovered that he was, in fact, a person of African descent. And I have no doubt that he did not reveal his identity and his background and the fact that his mother was an enslaved woman and that he, in fact, had been enslaved and was a freedman. I have no doubt that he understood that he would not be able to do the things within the Dutch Reformed Church had people known this, because this was, again, a time that Black members, if they were able to become members, really were restricted in these churches and certainly could not become could not become an elder and certainly not a minister in the church. So he's one of these examples that really shows the controversy that came out of it when they in fact discovered that he was not who they thought he was. Now going to the homes then, here's a depiction of Schuyler Mansion. And here too, we see increasingly that the enslaved people in these houses are restricted to certain areas of the homes, and that there's a more intentional way of thinking about these spaces and how they are organized. The Schuyler Mansion, which initially was built in the 1760s, was by Philip Schuyler, of course, is a very prominent in New York history. I'm sure you all know him, if not from his relations to Alexander Hamilton. I believe that really gave him national attention. But and the house, of course, still stands in Albany today, that you can visit. And when you visit this home, you go into these front doors. It's a beautiful space, large hallway, high ceilings, lots of natural light with high windows, lots of space. It's a beautiful home. But the enslaved people would not have spent their time in those spaces. Most of them would have been living and working in the cellar of Schuyler Mansion, as was the case in many New York homes. We see that enslaved people most often were residing in cellars and attics or garret spaces, like the one I showed you at the Lott House. So at the Schuyler Mansion, they were, many, if not all of them, were residing in the cellar of the Schuyler Mansion. And the cellar had only one entry point at the back of the house here. And this is a model of the home in the 18th century. And you can see that there was this walled courtyard that was, that their entry exit would have led to. And this allowed for really containing their movements in those spaces by having these walled courtyards and these windows that actually oversaw this courtyard and the labor in it. It would have restricted their movements. It also would have added systems of surveillance and monitoring, even when not watching. And this is, the idea of the panopticon, that even when not watching, you never know when you are being watched. And especially especially the women working for the Schuyler family, who would have done a lot of their labor within that courtyard, a lot of like food preparation and such. They would have very limited opportunities to actually exit that space without it being known. Now, one other thing that I think is very important here in thinking about this is that there's not only, the way that these physical spaces is organized that influences how people experience them. It's also that they symbolize something very different, right? So when you oftentimes, like a place like Schuyler Mansion, when you go there, it's oftentimes portrayed as, this remnant of Dutch American history. It's oftentimes, when we think of homes, we think of spaces of domesticity and family and safety. But for the enslaved people who lived in those spaces, it would have been a very different experience. And this is another thing that I really thought about as I was working about this. And it's not just a home, we see that with all of these spaces. But when we think about the home, we see that, for example, these were, if we think about family, in many cases, enslaved people were leaving those homes to be with family. They were separated from their family. They could not be with their family in the spaces that they lived. And one example is this, as they're called, the Runaway slave advertisements. This one from Rutgers van Brunt, who was one of the largest enslavers in Kings County, who here is searching for, and I'm quoting now, a mulatto girl named Mary, aged about 16 years. And it is supposed she is with her mother, a black wench named Mary, who said she lived with her husband, a stout black man, a few miles up the North River. This is just one example of the many advertisements like these in which we see that actually enslavers know or have suspicions where the people that fled their homes fled to, because they're not just fleeing those homes, they're also trying to reunite with family members, that they're going somewhere where they know that their loved ones are and they're not with them in the spaces that they're living. And, this is really a big part of slavery in New York, that as elsewhere, but something that oftentimes kind of is I think hidden in the narratives. There's oftentimes this way of talking about it as that enslaved families oftentimes were able to stay together or, lived in the same homes. And really, that is not the experience of many of the people enslaved in New York. And I want to just briefly bring you to Sojourner Truth's narrative. Sojourner Truth, of course, having been enslaved by a Dutch family, the Hardenberg family in Ulster County. And she later on recounts some of her experiences as an enslaved girl, then still being named Isabella Baumfree. And one of the things she talks about as she's telling her story of enslavement, and so this piece that I have here is in third person because she's narrating to another person. She recounts here what happens when her enslaver passes away, Charles Hardenberg. And at that point, she and her brother and father and mother were living together in the home of the Hardenberg family. Her parents had several children who had already been sold away from them. So Sojourner and her brother were the only ones they had left. And upon the passing of Charles Hardenberg, Sojourner Truth recounts the following experience, and I'm going to quote her now. After this event, so the event being the passing of their enslaver, she was often surprised to find her mother in tears And when, in her simplicity, she inquired, "Mama, what makes you cry?" she would answer, "Oh, my child, I'm thinking of your brothers and sisters that have been sold away from me." And she would proceed to detail many circumstances respecting them. But Isabella long since concluded that it was the impending fate of her only remaining children, which her mother bit too well understood, even then, that called upon those memories from the past and made them crucify her heart afresh. This passage really got me. I mean, I'm a mother. It really got me because what she's telling here, what she's recounting here, is that when their enslaver passed away, Sojourner Truth, her mother, realized that the last two children she still had by her side were going to be taken away from her. Sojourner Truth was 8 years old at the time and was indeed sold at auction not long after, together with her brother. And this was the fate of many enslaved families in New York, even if they're, even under the best circumstances, this was always a possibility, because when your enslaver passes away, the chances are that you will be sold and you will be separated. And we see it over and over. You can see it in the record, document after document, that details enslaved children that are sold, wills that detail children as old as 1 year old that will be separated from their mothers. And in some cases, children that are not even born yet are already in the will described as the children to be of my enslaved woman. I'm paraphrasing here now, will go to my daughter, for example. It's very common. And so, thinking about that and the meaning of these homes really it brings me to the words of Frederick Douglass, who of course was not enslaved in New York, but I have no doubt that what he is describing when he talked about the home where he was enslaved is very similar to the experiences that enslaved people in New York had. When he wrote, "It was not home to me," discussing the house in which he grew up. "On parting from it, I could not feel that I was leaving anything which I could have enjoyed by staying. I looked for home elsewhere, and I was confident of finding none which I could relish less than the one which I was leaving." So again, it's important to think about these spaces, not just as physical spaces, but also what they symbolize and what they mean to the people that were living in them, worshiping in them, moving through them. And then I want to just, as a very briefly, as I come to the end of my presentation, I just want to point out that my book also talks about resistance, and I haven't really talked about that today, but we do see resistance throughout. We see that enslaved people are finding alternative ways of navigating New York cities and rural areas by using different roads, different ways of moving through those cities. In Albany, for example, there's a record that demonstrates how enslaved people would move through alleyways or go from garden to garden or yard to yard, meeting in outhouses rather than in the marketplaces to sell goods, for example. We also see that they were doing the things that they could to make their homes safe and secure places as best as they could, those places that they were living in, like the Garrett space at the Lot House. And you can see some of those artifacts that, or some of the evidence of enslaved people doing that right here on the site that I am sharing with you. These are items that were found at the Lot House under the floorboards in that Garrett space that I showed you earlier. And actually you can see the corn cobs in the picture of that Garrett space. So here are some of the corn cobs that they found: a child's shoe, an oyster shell, goat pelvis, and a leather pouch. These items, that pouch actually contained the oyster shell and the goat pelvis. The corn cobs were placed in ritual position as a star, and in another cases, a cross. These items were very likely, I mean, they much resemble similar items and placement in other locations where enslaved Africans were living and working. And they are very likely placed there by those people who lived in the Garrett space at the Lot House to secure those spaces, to protect those spaces, as they often did with these items in both the Americas, and we see this in various African cultures. So like those pouches, those cachets resemble similar items like the gris-gris in the Senegambia region, or similar items that and practices that you also find in West Central Africa. So there's examples of enslaved people resisting the circumstances that they are in, resisting the surveillance imposed on them, the restrictions imposed on them in various ways. And I want to end with James Fenimore Cooper, because this to me was actually a very important kind of epiphany as I was looking very closely at these spaces. And that is that in the historiography, so when historians would write about this topic, and also in more popular discussions of slavery in New York, as is similar to slavery in other parts of the North, oftentimes the way it is described is that slavery in the North or slavery in New York was not that bad because enslaved people lived in the homes of their enslavers, and they worked alongside their enslavers, they worshiped in the same churches. But when you then really look closely at those spaces and their relationships in them, and where really they were located, or how they were able to live in those spaces and worship in those spaces, we see that really there's nothing farther from the truth. Just because they lived in the same home does not mean that they lived in the same parts of the home, or that they experienced that home the same way. And so James Fenimore Cooper is an example of kind of that type of description. In his Satan's Toe, he talks about slavery in New York, and I'm quoting him now here. He writes, "New York never had slaves on this system of Southern planters, or in gangs of hundreds, to labor in the fields under overseers, and who lived apart in cabins of their own. But our system of slavery was strictly domestic, the Negro almost invariably living under the same roof with the master, or if his habitation was detached, as certainly sometimes happened, it was still near at hand, leaving both races as part of a common family." And that last sentence, it just gets me every time, because surely you would not sell your own family members, or let them stay in the Garrett spaces like we've seen at the Lot House, or not allow them in your churches to worship alongside with you. And so but it's not until we really look at this closely that becomes very evident. And so yes, slavery in New York was different than it was in, for example, Georgia. But the difference was more so in the type of labor people were forced to produce, and much less so in the way that the system was organized. And that's where I'm going to end. I think it's perfect timing. I see Will is ready to intervene. Thank you.
Right.
Would you like me to stop sharing?
Yes, please. And everyone, I'm going to invite you to unmute. And we have several questions and comments that folks have put in the chat throughout the presentation. So I'm going to begin with those. And our first question tonight, Andrea, is from Susan. She would love to know where you found the info about the Shawangunk patrols.
Let me think. I think this was at the New York Historical Society. And if you really want to know, I can send you the records, and I can easily find where it is. But I don't remember off the top of my head. But I think it was at the New York Historical Society that I found that. And there's several documents that discuss it. So I just shared a short part of that with you.
Okay. And While we're on that topic, we have a follow-up question about those patrols and others you mentioned, like the night watchman in Albany. How would these be comparable to Southern slave patrols?
I would say yes. I mean, I don't see a difference personally when looking at how they functioned, why they were there, how they really were used to ensure that there was nothing going on that was not allowed. It really is very clearly the similar type of system. So yes, absolutely, I would say so.
So Douglas says he really enjoyed the book and appreciates your emphasis on the importance of place and location for its influence on enslavement. He was wondering if you had an opinion on whether there was more opportunity for freedom seekers or free Blacks in the upstate, more physical space around Beavervik and Schenectady, or rather in the downstate areas around New Amsterdam. So does either of those give a better opportunity?
Different opportunities, I would say. And this also, of course, depends on the time period. But we see in the area of, for example, Schenectady and Albany, that there's always the possibility of fleeing to the Haudenosaunee or the French colonies. And the Dutch definitely talk about this. And in Albany, in the 18th century, we see similar, there's legislation that actually discusses that explicitly. In a place like New York and the New York areas, the fact that you're closer to a port city, that would have helped, and that would have perhaps given opportunities to actually be able to escape the area via ship. And this is oftentimes mentioned in these runaway save advertisements, a warning to captains to make sure that there's nobody on board those ships who should not be there. So the opportunities for fleeing differ. And then, of course, in the late 18th century and early 19th century, we see that after places like Massachusetts abolish slavery, that there's also people who are very targeted, like are trying to make their way to those areas.
Great. Thank you. Grace Angela Henry, whom I'm sure you know from Historic Huguenot Street, says, you mentioned the possibility of the enslaved being able to communicate with geographically, I would guess, distant family and friends at church, and that as restrictions increased, the enslaved were less able to take advantage of attending church. Will you say more about why attending Dutch Reformed churches was an advantage to the enslaved, as opposed to being something that they were forced to do as another form of control?
So this really depends again on the time period. During the 17th century, we see that enslaved people who are attending the Dutch Reformed Church in New Amsterdam, so those churches that I pointed out to you, the people that were listed there, many of them were married in that church, baptized their children in that church. And we see that that is something that oftentimes comes back in their freedom petitions, for example, that they're referring to the fact that they are Christian, that they therefore should be allowed to gain their freedom. And this all fit in within debates at the time of, can you really enslave other Christians? Then, by the latter part of the 18th or early 19th century, one of the things that I think, again, very similar to this in some ways, one of the benefits that there might be is that one way to really become part of a community and be able to socially advance in a community that was predominantly Dutch and centered around a Dutch Reformed church, as we see in many of these communities, would have been participation in the Dutch Reformed Church. So that could have been a way to also, outside of the church, advance your circumstances. So it's similar to what we see in the 17th century, though it less so revolved around, arguments of enslaving Christians. But I think it could make a difference in that sense.
Thank you. That's certainly how Sojourner Truth got her lawyers. They were Dutch lawyers who did her case for free. and they were
Mhm.
from the church. Thank
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
So our own Judge Al Rosenblatt offers that the New York State Archives just found the occasional writ. Hello, Al. Just found the occasional writ of habeas corpus in the case of Sojourner Truth's son, Peter. And Al, since you're on, do you want to expand on that?
This is a spectacular discovery. Just imagine everyone here who knows a little bit, or some people a lot more, about the Sojourner Truth case. And we knew that it arose in Kingston, but only about 10 days ago did Tom Ruller and the people at New York Archives find the actual writ of habeas corpus. I have it right here. Here's a copy of it, and it's available, ordering, which Judge Hasbrook, Commissioner Hasbrook, ordered that the boy, Peter, be produced in court before him so that he could then make a ruling on the return of the boy to his mother, Isabella Waganon, i.e. Isabella Waganon, i.e. Sojourner Truth. What an extraordinary document. And Tom Ruller found it. Human Falls is going through boxes of unindexed stuff, and he reading along, and he says, wait a minute, Isabella Van Waganon, oh my goodness, isn't that Sojourner Truth? Yeah.
It's amazing.
Thank you, Al. So Pamela Bentine asks, did restrictions on enslaved people and free Blacks increase because the colony became English, or was it just a result of restrictions increasing over time?
So I would absolutely say it has nothing to do with it becoming English. I am 100% convinced that if it had stayed Dutch, it would be exactly the same thing. We see this happening across the colonies in Virginia, New England. We see a very similar development where by the latter part of the 17th century, the reliance on the labor of enslaved people just increases significantly, and it becomes more clearly the labor of enslaved Africans. And this coincides then with the increasing slave trade in the 18th century, which really, starts like, it's amazing if you look at how it increases and during this period. So it's something that we see across the board. It's not something that is different in New Netherlands. And in fact, like I said, in Virginia, we also see enslaved people are able to obtain their freedom or own property in the 17th century. So that is not a particular Dutch thing. It's just more something that in this early period, slavery and enslavement is still something that the Dutch and the English are developing a system for and don't have it all figured out yet. So it's not particular to the Dutch.
Great. Cynthia, I see you're here. Do you want to ask your question rather than having me read it?
Okay, that's fine, Will. I just, obviously, the whole system of enslavement was a brutalizing influence. And one of the things that I think we need to take into account is how that brutalization, in fact, led to the increasingly restrictive legal restrictions on the lives of enslaved Africans and free Blacks as slave revolts increased, which is, understandable under the horrific circumstances. But there also was a response to increasing violence, which was then violently suppressed by New York and as well as other colonial and ultimately state legislatures. I just wanted to see what our author thinks about that, and then can she expound a little bit upon that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we see that the reason why there is, this increased need to restrict the movements of people is because of that worry. And then we see in legislation that when there is slave resistance, they respond to that by implementing stricter legislation. Sorry. So one example would be the Hallett murder in Queens County. where a father, a pregnant wife, and children are killed by the people they enslaved, a man and a woman, one indigenous, one of African descent. And that particular case horrified people in the area. It scared them. I mean, of course it would. The fact that this whole family was killed, and it appears then in legislation. It's referenced in when discussing some of the new legislation to restrict the movement of enslaved people. And the same thing happens after the 1711 slave revolt in New York City. So absolutely, there is a movement to increase these restrictions, but then it's reinforced or strengthened at moments that there is this pushback from the people who are held in bondage and fighting for their freedom. So yes, absolutely. That's a big part of it.
I have another question, which maybe I could just jump in since I sort of a little bit of the floor. We live in Dutchess County, and one of the things that I've begun to understand is that this goes back to a previous discussion between the English and the Dutch. And one of the things I've begun to apprehend is that the slavery along the river was more frequent and more intense, more readily practiced than it was in the backcountry, like out near the town of Clinton, where I live, in sort of eastern Dutchess County. And of course, people then, I think, extrapolate from that to say, oh, well, the Dutch were more prone to enslavement than the English. And part of that, I think, might even have to do with the prevalence of Quakers in Dutchess County. It was, and maybe other parts of our region, because it was one of the, I've been told after Philadelphia region, that this part of New York State was the most populous area of Society of Friends settlement. Do you know anything about that? I'd love to hear your ideas on that.
I actually don't. I do know that, that there are plenty of Quakers who were enslaving and trading in enslaved people. So it during the early period, that would not have really made a difference. I do think that what you're saying there's I think it's an important point. I'm not the one to defend the Dutch in any way, but I mean, we all know that the English were not hesitant in enslaving people either. And so I don't see what the reason would have been why in New York, people of English ancestry would be less likely to hold people in bondage when they had no problem doing it in other parts of the Atlantic world, right? So I think that, and a place like Queens County, for example, had a very large enslaved population, was one of the larger ones, and that was predominantly English. So I don't think there's any truth to that, but it does stand out. And it's certainly true that people of Dutch descent in New York were very heavily participating in the enslavement of people and in sustaining the system of slavery in the colony and later on the state. So.
Okay, thank you.
All right, we've got another more general history question. So now that you've talked about these spaces of enslavement, how would one potentially go about identifying them within historical structures of the pre-1827 period in parts of New York that you haven't covered in your book? So maybe perhaps here in Dutchess County.
Yeah, so you mean, how would you identify them? If you would go into a house like that, how would you know?
Yeah, I think that's the question. And a follow-up question was, were garrets only for enslaved persons, or did other types of people live in those small spaces?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so those are both great questions. So one of the things, I mean, here archaeologists are really crucial, and they would be able to, perhaps find evidence, as they did at the Lot House, of where the enslaved people lived. in most places, it was in cellars or in attics or Garrett spaces. There's a few places where there were outbuildings, outhouses where enslaved people would be residing, or if there was an external kitchen, then sometimes they would sleep in the Garrett spaces or attic spaces of those places. So, when you live in a house like that, those would be the areas where most likely the enslaved people would have been. But to really definitively find, no, you would have to find some evidence, and this can be documentary evidence, but it can also be like through archaeological research, and it doesn't necessarily have to be like candle wax or something like that. It could be there's evidence of drawings of star symbolism, which was very important in many African societies, that are sometimes found in kitchens, like basement cellar kitchens in New York. And that is a sign that very likely enslaved people at least worked there, and very likely also saw that really as their space where they were able to create, to make something like that, to put something like that. So that would be my answer to the first part of the question. And then the second one, you have to refresh my memory. Sorry. What was
that
the
second one? Were these Garrett dwelling spaces exclusively for enslaved persons?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the answer would be no. I think that there would have been cases where indentured servants would have been residing in those spaces as well. In most of the cases that I've looked at this, though, there were no indentured servants in the same homes, living in the same homes or the same spaces as enslaved people. But there are a few cases where that may have been, where it suggests that they may have shared a space. I think it's less common, though, and it would definitely be predominantly enslaved people staying in those spaces, but it's not exclusively.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I live in a home in Coxsackie, New York, dated 1797. Slaves were residing in our basement, in our cellar. And we've lived here for 50 years. And there is a family cemetery that is surrounded by a fence. And for many years, I noticed outside of that cemetery, sandstone outcroppings. And for the longest time, it seemed strange, out of place, until I happened to be looking at the cemetery in the Bronx House, which is the Greene County Historical site. And their cemetery was set up with the owners and their families in the front. But in the back, the slave cemetery was the sandstone outcroppings, the same as I have except it's not as orderly. Mine is not as orderly as theirs. My question is there any organization or some kind of body that you could suggest that I could talk to, rather than have these stones simply sitting there unrecognized and neglected?
Yeah. There are people that you might want to reach out to, and I'm blanking on their names right now. Peggy Lord, I think, is one of them who really works on this. But if you send me a message, if you send me an email, I will happily get back to you and see if I can, suggest some people or organizations that might be good to talk to, that might be interested.
Now,
So,
do we have your email address?
it's very easy to find, but I'll put it also here in the chat, and then you can see it.
And if
Do
for
you see
some
it?
reason you missed that, you can always go to the Historic Red Hook website at historicredhook.org, and you'll find the society's contact information there, and we can put you in touch with the professor.
Thank
Awesome.
you very much.
Thank you.
So Dylan Streifenator, who is a fellow academic, asks, Michael Groth has mentioned mid-18th century statutes that discouraged manumission by charging owners significant bonds. Did Dutch laws similarly discourage manumission?
So I'm not sure what Dutch laws you're thinking about, because so within these Dutch communities that I looked at, they would have gone by those same statutes, right? And this is absolutely true. Like, there were different things to really discourage the freeing of enslaved people, and we see the similar thing again also in the South, where people really don't want a large free Black population, and this was one of the ways in which they did that. So in the case of these Dutch communities, that would have been the same thing. That legislation would actually, also pertain to them. If we're talking about the larger Dutch Atlantic world, I actually can't think of any examples, but I'm sure it had happened in other places as well, in other Dutch colonies as well. This was very common, like I said, to try to limit the number of freed people in these communities. So I have no doubt.
All right. We have an earlier question asking, do you want to comment on the difficulties of teaching about enslavement and studying the institution under the current environment?
Sure, I'd be happy to comment on that. I don't have any problems teaching this. I don't hold back teaching it. But I do know that this is something that I worry, as we're trying to, as I think we're really advancing in how we understand slavery and kind of looking at it with a more critical lens. This pushback in telling these histories is definitely always there. I talked about this with some people that when I was in Albany this fall, I did a presentation, and some of the people there were like, why did we never get this taught in school? Why did we never learn any of this in school? And this brought us to the conversation of, that there's all this research that's coming out that would really allow for that curriculum to expand. But it is very possible that legislation will try to limit that, right? Or we'll try to stop that, and maybe less so in New York. But I teach in Louisiana, and they already had such legislation going to the legislators here. It wasn't passed, thankfully, but in Mississippi, right next door, it was passed. So it certainly is always there. But in my experience, I've never had anybody challenge this in a way that felt threatening or whatever. I think that when you talk to most people really want to learn more about this history, and that is the case also here in Louisiana. Most people are very interested and want to hear more, not less. So it doesn't influence my teaching. But who knows, if there would be legislation that would not allow me to teach it in the same way, then certainly it would. But without that, I will just soldier on and tell the story as I understand it.
On that note, we will conclude. Thank you very much, Professor Mosterman, for your time this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us. If anyone has questions for the professor, you can, she's put her email in the chat, but you can also reach out to Historic Red Hook. We hope to see you at future events. And if you'd like to support the organization's mission and future programming like this, please feel free to visit historicredhook.org and hit that donation button. So Everyone have a great evening. Thank you again, Andrea, for joining us from New Orleans, and we will look forward to seeing you all next month for Sarah Hermans' presentation.
Thank you.